Hi, Grandma here, and I am reading Chapter 2 of Toliver's Secret. To review a little bit, we know that this takes place during the Revolutionary War, and these are British soldiers, and this looks like it's a boy, but the British soldiers look friendly, but the boy still looks very nervous. It takes place in New York City, so this is New York Harbor with the boat, the ship in the background. And their main characters so far are the grandfather, whose name is Van Horn. He's of Dutch descent. Abby, who is a widow. Her husband has died. We don't know how he died. And then the daughter, Ellen, who is around 11 years old. There's also a son named Ezra, but we haven't met him yet. And Ellen's big job is to go to the well to get water. And they just moved there about a month earlier. But there is a bully that is there named Dicey, and she makes it very difficult for Ellen to get water, so she hates this job. Chapter 2. Ellen dreaded that trip to the pump. It would be good to stay in the safe, warm kitchen and never go out. A crackling fire on the hearth made bright lights on the copper pans and on the blue china plates in the cupboard. It made the quilt on the big bed look like a field of bluebells and shone on the bunches of dried herbs that hung from the shadowy rafters overhead. Ellen looked around. "This kitchen makes me happy," she said. "It makes me happy too," Mother said wistfully. "I used to sew and knit with my mother here by the fire. She taught me my lessons here at this big table by this very window." On the table was a basket of clay curlers and combs and brushes, as well as a wig stand covered with a net and a half-made wig. White hair spilled from a wooden box. "We used to sit here and curl and dress the wigs for my father's customers, and help him make some of the wigs, too," Mother added. "And now you and I dress the wigs for the red coat officers." And that's what these guys are red coats. "Yes," said Mother sadly. "Here we are curling wigs for the soldiers who have come to defeat us, and there's not much you and I can do about it. These are terrible mixed up times, Ellen." Ellen knew that well enough, ever since the British Army came to New York last summer. She remembered the night in August when the alarm had come to their village. The British had landed on Long Island. Her father's thin face had been grim when he locked up his schoolhouse and rushed off with his musket to join the other men in the village militia. That very night, the militia had marched off to Brooklyn Heights to help General Washington defend Long Island and New York. In spite of all of her mother's pleading, Ezra, the brother, went with him. He was only 15, but he could shoot as well as a man. "We'll send those cutthroats back to old King George," he had boasted. Everyone knew the brave patriots could drive the British out. Washington had driven them out in Boston last year, hadn't he? But the British had 3 times as many men as Washington had, and all of them were well trained in war. They defeated him at Brooklyn Heights, and they captured New York City. They drove his army north, and in November captured Fort Washington, where they took 3,000 prisoners. People heard the news in stunned surprise. Then the British took Fort Lee across Hudson's River with all of the Washington's cannon, and finally sent what was left of the army scurrying across New Jersey. The colonists could hardly believe such news. They'd felt so sure that courage and the will to win would be enough to beat back the British. "Where do you think Ezra is today, Mother?" Immediately, Ellen was sorry she'd asked, for Mother bit her lip and was silent. "Oh, only the good Lord knows," she said at last. "If he's alive and isn't on a prison ship, he must have gone to Pennsylvania with Washington's army." Ellen knew that asking about Ezra had reminded her mother of the other news that had come to them after the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. Her father had been killed. Many men from their village had been killed that day. She and her mother had been all alone. Mother was nervous and upset most of the time and worried about what to do. when at last they had no more money, no more food in their storeroom, and no money to buy anything, and the November days were growing bitter cold, Mother had said, "Our neighbors can't help us, for they have as much hardship as we. There's nothing to do but to go back to my father, Ellie, even if the town is in the hands of the enemy now." "How can we travel, Mother?" Ellen had asked. "Well, we must walk. There's naught else to be done." And so they had walked 10 miles back to New York. Grandfather had welcomed them joyfully and had given them the big kitchen to live in while he slept on the couch in his shop. The rest of the house was already occupied with British officers. "Now remember, Ellen," Mother had said, "we must be very careful here. Most of the people who've stayed in New York are friends of the British and want them to win the war. Not Grandfather, of course, nor any of his friends. Those of us who are patriots here in town must lie low." "Oh, just like rabbits in a rabbit hole," Ellen suggested. Mother shrugged her shoulders and sighed. "Well, rabbits know how to act when the enemy is all around them. And I suppose rabbits still need water," Ellen grumbled aloud to herself. No longer able to put off the trip to the pump, she pulled on her stout leather shoes, picked up her red cloak. It was a good warm cloak that her mother had made, and it hung almost to the hem of her long wool dress. To stay safe indoors all winter would make her very happy. But of course, since the wooden bucket was quite empty, there was nothing to do but pull her cloak around her, cover her head with the hood, and start. She took a long breath. If she went very slowly, she might find that Dicey had gone home. "Just go to another pump, Ellen, if Dicey bothers you," her mother said. "Don't go asking for trouble." Walking slowly through the barber shop, Ellen passed the counter that ran along the wall. On the counter were 5 china wig stands with painted gentlemen's faces beneath fancy white wigs. They looked, Ellen thought, as they were smirking at her. "Smiling like idiots," she said, "and you don't even see the jar of leeches there beside you." The dark, slimy little worms lay quietly in the water that filled a big green jar. Barbers always had leeches handy to put on bruises and swelling. Ellen found them almost too horrible to look at. I'm going to pause here. Barbers back in the day were, they treated wounds. And I read somewhere that the red and white stripes that you often see on a barber pole is reminiscent of the bandages and of them using leeches to get infection out and to get swelling down. So the red and white stripes that go up the poles are for bandages and blood, which was a part of the barber's job at that time. It wasn't just cutting hair or fixing hair. From the kitchen, she heard her mother call after her, "Mind the slippery steps, Ellen, and don't talk to strangers." Mother always said that every time she went out, and Ellen never talked to strangers. It seemed to Ellen that Mother worried about everything. With great care, Ellen crept down the icy steps of the barber shop and out into the street. The air smelled of winter. Snow and sweet wood smoke mixed all together. It was only half light in the early mornings, but already the apprentices were sweeping the steps of the shops and brushing the snow from the signs overhead. As nimbly as she could, she dodged out of the way of carts and wagons that rumbled along slowly while their horses slipped and slid on the icy cobblestones. It seemed to her that every man with a wheelbarrow barked at her to get out of the way, and every workman with a load on his shoulders seemed to give her a shove. People were cross on a nipping, cold morning. When she walked with Grandfather on Sunday afternoons, things were different, for he was friends with almost everyone in the neighborhood. Even when they walked down to the Battery or out Bowery Lane to the country, he always stopped to chat with friends. "Jump aside!" shouted 3 girls as they sloshed along with full water buckets. Ellen hopped out of their way just in time to get hit by a snowball. Across the street, the Brinkerhof boys were knocking icicles down from the roof with snowballs. They hurled several at her, but she pretended not to notice. She'd not even reached the corner when a tall, thin man with a tallow-spattered apron shouted at her roughly. "Look sharp, girl," he roared as he pulled her against the wall, knocking her bucket from her hand and spilling his own basket of candles. Down the busy street dashed 3 officers on big black horses. Without a glance to either side, they rode as if they owned the whole world. "Drat those redcoats," muttered the candlemaker. "The lordly way they push us around." He knelt to gather up his candles. "Did I hurt you, girl?" "No, sir," said Ellen politely. She began to help him pick up his candles. The more she delayed, the more chance there was that Dicey might have gone home by the time she reached the pump. The neighborhood pump was only 2 blocks away, although it seemed like a mile to Ellen. As she came near, she could hear the old wooden handle creak and groan. A group of women and girls were waiting in line to fill their buckets. They huddled in their shawls and stamped their feet to keep warm. Ellen looked cautiously to see whether Dicey was there before she took her place at the end of the line. The women were talking about the same things they talked about every morning: high prices, the high price of wool, the high price of firewood, the high price of cornmeal and flour and mutton. That kind of talk made Ellen worry about eating anything at all. "Has Dicey been here this morning?" she asked the woman ahead of her. She was an old woman with a work-worn face, dressed in a man's coat instead of a shawl. "Oh, she's gone home, I reckon," muttered the woman. "Oh, that's good." Ellen heaved a sigh of relief as she pulled her red cloak about her. "I was hoping she wouldn't be here."